Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Sid Meier's Colonization, originally released for DOS, but later re-released on Amiga, Macintosh, and Windows. What you're seeing here is, of course, the DOS version. This is a turn-based 4X strategy game by Microprose that was originally released in 1994 for DOS and later ported to other systems in 1995. And while a lot of people mistake this as being part of the Civilization series, it really is its own game. It doesn't really share a lot of mechanics with the Civilization series, and it is considerably more narrow in scope. While the Civilization series concerns itself with forging an empire over thousands of years and going from the dawn of civilization up to modern day and beyond, Colonization is about the discovery and colonization of the New World, basically from the 15th century up through the 18th century. And while the game did suffer from a bit of controversy surrounding its subject matter, it actually was a very well received game overall in its day. So that of course begs the question of how well it holds up to this day, and compared to other games of that era, how is it? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out. Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's definitely looking very dated these days, but to be fair, it was released in 1994 and it was a DOS game. And keeping that in mind, I'd say the visuals hold up reasonably well, although certain sprites are a bit difficult to tell apart from one another. Sometimes you end up having to click around to tell what particular units you're dealing with because some of the sprites are just so similar to one another that it's really hard to tell at just a glance until you're really used to playing the game. Because there's really not much detail in this game overall. It is very low res, and you do have some very, very low detail sprite work. Now luckily the low detail in the sprites isn't so low that you can't tell what you're looking at all, it's just so low that you sometimes have difficulty discerning the specifics, although you can pretty easily tell what something is just from a general look. Now, if I'm confusing you in terms of my wording here, let me go ahead and just give you an example. So, if you look at a unit, you can pretty easily tell whether it's a civilian unit or a military unit. But until you've played the game for quite a while and you've gotten used to the small eccentricities of the sprites, then you're not going to necessarily know whether a unit is inexperienced or veteran, or, for example, if you're dealing with dragoons or scouts or something along those lines. Because those sprites are just so similar that it actually becomes very difficult to tell them apart. Now, it's not completely unmanageable. I mean, this is a turn-based game. You have all the time you need to look over the units and look at which ones you got on the field at any given moment and say, oh, well, that's a dragoon, or that's a scout, or this is a distiller, this is a fur trapper, etc. But it feeds into an accessibility problem that the game generally suffers from. More details on that when we get to the gameplay, although I do want to briefly mention the UI in general. There is definitely an adjustment period that you have to go through, and this being a rather old strategy game that's turn-based, you generally are going to be using the numpad to move your units around. Technically you can do everything with the mouse, but it's not very intuitive, and you're going to end up using hotkeys a lot. But there is one aspect of the visuals that I want to mention as well that is particularly problematic, and that is the characters. Now, I don't mean the actual unit sprites, I mean the character portraits that show up whenever major events come along or when you're looking at the Continental Congress screen. Just look at them. They look terrible. Even when compared to other games of that era, they look terrible, and it's just kind of baffling that they managed to screw them up that badly. But ultimately, when I say that the visuals hold up reasonably well, I don't mean that they're good to look at or anything like that. I mean, they get the job done, and that's pretty much what you would expect from a strategy game of that era. This is about as low detail as a game can get before it starts to interfere with your ability to actually play it. Luckily, Colonization doesn't really suffer from that issue, although it does take quite a bit of getting used to, and some of the text is rather small. So if you have issues reading small text, then it may actually give you a bit of trouble there. Now that said, as much of a mixed bag as the visuals are, what about the sound design? Well, there's not really all that much sound design to speak of here. The game has a MIDI soundtrack that is a whole lot of fife and drum, which basically means that it's very fitting for the colonial era, but it ultimately ends up becoming extremely repetitive extremely quickly. There are a few tracks here and there that do sound like they were ripped straight out of the Civilization games as well, and those fit in more with the Native American themes, but even those quickly become repetitive because all of the music is on a fairly short loop. Also, when the music's not bad, it's just that it wears on you after a while if you're playing this for a long period of time. Which, given that this is a 4X strategy game, you probably are going to be playing it for extended lengths of time. Now, other than the music, there is no voice acting at all in the game. This was before that was really much of a thing. But then there are the sound effects, which are very few and far between. There are almost no sound effects in this game, but when they do come up, they just do their job, and that's about it. And they're not PC speaker sounds, so there is that, but it's just kind of a shame that there's not really a lot going on here in terms of audio feedback. But I guess that's in keeping with the visuals as well. There's not a whole lot going on in the visuals. You're not getting any fancy animations, you're not getting any real cutscenes or anything like that. It's mostly just slideshow animations at best. And most of what you're relying on is the game just telling you what you need to know for the mechanics to work more than anything else. And of course that ultimately leads me to what really matter, which are story, or rather lack thereof, and gameplay. Because when you sum up the presentation, well, there's not a whole lot going on there, and it is very, very dated. So now that we've covered the presentation, what about the story and gameplay? Well, the story is not much more than setup for what you're actually going to be doing throughout the course of the game, so there's not really much to speak of there. The idea is that you pick one of 4 factions and then you set forth to explore and settle the new world. You'll meet numerous Native American tribes who you can interact with as you please, and you'll also meet other colonists from other nations, and your meetings may not necessarily go the way you hope. The old grudges do still somewhat apply here, so you'll find that if there's a war going on in mainland Europe between 2 factions, then the relationship between those 2 factions is probably going to be fairly sour in the New World as well. Now, the ultimate goal of the game is to break off the chains of being a colony of an imperial nation in mainland Europe and become your own sovereign nation. This is a lot easier said than done, because the nations of mainland Europe definitely do not want to give up their colonies at all, and you're going to have to fight for it. So really the story of the game is that you start off in service of the crown and you go off to explore and settle the new world, and then over time things get worse and worse and worse until eventually you say screw it and you just declare your independence from the imperial nations of Europe and you become your own sovereign nation, or at least you try to. There's just not a whole lot going on from a narrative standpoint, so what it ultimately falls to is the gameplay. And that's where things get very interesting, because if you've played Civilization and you think you can just hop into this game and be fine, you'd be horribly mistaken. This game plays almost nothing like Civilization. It still has a turn-based structure, it still has a grid for moving units around, and it still has the sort of production system from the Civilization games in it, but it's handled in a very different way. The first thing you'll notice is that all of your settlements only have an area extending 1 block around them in every direction. Unlike in Civilization, this area of influence does not grow over time, and you'll also find that your actual citizens don't necessarily automatically grow. Really, the game's all about micromanaging your colonists to make the best use of the various cities that you've got. You kind of have to specialize your settlements. This isn't just because you have that 1 block of radius around the settlement, but it's also because you have very limited resources to work with. Now, I don't mean that the resources that you have to work with in the world itself are limited. I mean that the resources you have to utilize are very limited. You really have 2 resources available to you. These are gold, which is just used to buy any number of things. You can buy normal units, whether it be colonists or military units. You can buy ships, you can buy artillery, you can use it to recruit experienced people from the old world and bring them over to the new world. And of course you can use it to mediate disputes over land or whatever the case may be. But that's actually not your primary resource. Your primary resource is your colonists. So let me give you a quick breakdown of that. You have the dichotomy between military and civilian units, and you also have the dichotomy between veterans and inexperienced. And unlike in the Civilization games, the veteran status doesn't only apply to military units, it actually applies to civilian ones as well. So to give you an example, you can take one of your free colonists and place them on a tile to be a lumberjack, or you can have expert lumberjacks to work that tile, and they'll actually be a lot more productive. And of course with military units, if you've got veteran military units, they just fight better than the inexperienced units do, so that's something else to keep in mind. Now your civilian units can work either in the tiles that are around the town that you've got set up, or they can work in the buildings within the town. And something else you're going to need to keep track of is the secondary resources in addition to your colonists and your gold. These are things like lumber, ore, food, cotton, all sorts of different things like that that you can either turn into finished goods like, say, rum or cloth, or you can trade them to either get gold or to get things that you might really want. So for example, if one person really has a lot of, say, coats, and you need coats, well, you can go trade whatever you've got with them for coats. Over time, prices for goods will fluctuate, and if the taxes go too high on something, then you can stage a effectively tea party on them, and then you can no longer trade that good with the old world, but you can still trade it with the new world, and that's something you have to really keep in mind as you're going through the game. You find out very quickly that the vast majority of the strategy in this game is centered around how well you actually micromanage your colonists, as well as how good you are at actually trading things with your neighbors and the old world and maintaining a good balance there. Because keep in mind, you're trying to work towards self-sufficiency. You're trying to work towards being able to field an army large enough to fight off the invasion force when it comes from the mainland. And when the Empire comes knocking, it comes with a massive horde of units. It is not uncommon to find yourself fighting hundreds of units from the mainland when you declare independence, so it's something you really need to prepare for. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done because actually training military units in the New World is kind of a pain. First, you need weapons to arm them with, and you can either produce those in the colonies or you can actually buy them from the old world and bring them back. Next, you need to decide whether they're going to be infantry or cavalry, and if they're going to be cavalry, then you need a supply of horses to arm them with as well. And then on top of all of that, you need a colonist to be able to switch over to the soldier role. And what you'll probably end up doing with that is using all of the petty criminals that you'll be accruing over the course of the game, because for some reason the game really likes throwing those your way. And you're going to turn them into soldiers because they're terrible at production, and it takes a very long time and a lot of effort in order to bring them up to being on the same level as free colonists, for example. Because you certainly can actually educate your various colonists in the various roles. You just need someone who's already mastered that particular skill in order to actually train it to somebody. It's a very time-consuming process, and it ends up tying up one of your master workers while they're actually teaching someone, so you really need to choose whether or not you want to take the hit in production in order to train up somebody else. And with the petty criminals in particular, you have to train them up just so they'll become indentured servants, and then train them up again so they'll become free colonists. It's a mess. Thus, they end up basically becoming your fodder for the army, which is really not all that surprising, sadly. Sometimes you will get lucky and there'll be veteran soldiers or veteran dragoons available in the old world for you to bring back, but most of the time you're just going to be stuck with colonists that you have to actually train up to be soldiers. And as a result, you're pretty much always outclassed and outgunned, especially when the king comes knocking with that massive army of doom. But even when you're fighting other colonials, you'll find that they often have fairly large armies and you're not really sure how they manage to do that. And if you're familiar with the way Civilization's combat works, then you're going to find that it's pretty much the same thing here. You have stacks of units that you can order around, and if you have a lot of units in one particular stack, then that stack is probably going to win all the time. Especially if you take advantage of the terrain, because you'll find that terrain bonuses can often turn the tide. But beyond that, there's really not any strong strategy to the combat. It's just you move your units around so they're advantageous in terms of terrain, and you can sometimes fortify your position, but other than that, there's really nothing to it. It becomes painfully obvious the game was not designed around combat, even though combat is a major focus in the latter half of the game. And that becomes incredibly frustrating to deal with when you do finally get to the end game, because the entire time you've been able to get into the resource management, into the colonist management, which is where all the real meat of the gameplay lies, and then in order to get a victory condition, you have to actually go in and fight off an absolutely massive horde of enemies. And let's put it this way. If the combat system is pretty much the same as Civilization's, only with a smaller resource pool available to you, then that's not a good thing, because the combat in the Civilization games up until Civilization 5 was absolutely terrible. I want you to think about that for a second. It took them almost 20 years to come to a combat system that isn't terrible with the Civ series, and the combat system in Civ 5 and 6 isn't really all that great either, it's just decent. And what you're dealing with in Colonization is pretty much the very first iteration of the garbage combat system from the Civ series. It's just a disaster. And that's a real shame too, because the rest of the game is actually fairly compelling. It's kind of interesting to set up the trade routes, it's interesting to manage all your trade resources, it's interesting to manage all your colonist resources. But once you hit that part where you're trying to win your independence and the king sends his massive army after you, well, it goes downhill very quickly. Now, I'll admit, I am willing to cut Colonization some slack as far as its combat goes because it was released in 1994, and that was actually before Civilization 2 even happened. But when it comes down to it, that combat system is one of the major hurdles you're going to have to deal with if you're going to try to get any enjoyment out of this thing. Of course, funnily enough, once you get past the colonist management and the training up your army before you go off and fight in an extremely simplistic combat system, the rest of the game is actually very straightforward. After enough Liberty Bells are generated, you'll be able to add someone to your Continental Congress, and these are various historical figures that would not necessarily have been at the same historical time period, of course, but they still give you various passive bonuses that can end up being extremely powerful. For example, one of them basically gives you free stockades, which are of course walls, for every single settlement once they hit 3 population. Now keep in mind, otherwise you have to actually go and manually build the stockade, in which case you have to have someone generating hammers, which is just the production resource, like it is in Civ games of course. And in order to produce hammers, you need lumber in a particular settlement, so you'll probably need someone being a lumberjack as well, which means that you've already tied up 2 colonists in order to just build something. Plus, it'll take numerous turns to generate the amount of hammers required to actually build the thing, and on top of that, you may need additional resources for that particular building. Now, in the case of the stockade, you don't, but still. Point is that having a free stockade whenever your population in a settlement hits 3 is a very powerful bonus. And while some of the bonuses that you get from certain members of the Continental Congress are better than others, all of them are useful. Let's just say you've been ignoring missionaries the whole game. Well, all of a sudden you'll find someone in your Continental Congress lineup that may be really useful for them. So for example, you can have one that will make all of your missionaries act as expert missionaries instead of just plain old missionaries. You may think that the missionaries are just there to spread Christianity or whatever, but that's really not the case. If you put them into a native settlement and establish a mission there, then you can actually gradually get converts as basically free colonists. You can also use missionaries to basically incite various Native American tribes against other European colonists, which gets pretty amusing when you get down to it, because they'll start raiding their settlements, and then those various colonists will be like, well crap, now we gotta deal with this, and you get to sit there laughing maniacally as you build up all of your forces to basically curb stomp them. And I guess that's the thing about a relatively primitive example of a strategy game like Colonization. Pretty much everything has its uses. There's nothing that you could really consider to be extraneous. And how well you use the tools the game gives you is really entirely up to you. Now of course the game does try to push you in one direction or another whenever you select your parent faction. You can choose between the French, the English, the Spanish, or the Dutch, and each of them have specific bonuses that you get starting out. So for example, the French get a free pioneer unit to start with instead of just a colonist unit, and on top of that, they get various bonuses to cooperating with the Native American tribes. The English get bonuses to immigration, so basically they have a faster rate of people showing up in the old world to come to the new world. The Dutch get bonuses to trade, and on top of that they get a merchantman ship, which is extremely useful because everyone else starts with a caravel, which is the weakest ship in the game. And then last but not least, we have Spain. The Spanish are jerks. Their entire thing is conquest, and they get bonuses to basically crushing the Native American tribes under their boot heels. Because whenever they raid things, they get bonus treasure. And treasure means more gold, which means more units and more ships and such like that. Also, the Spanish AI in the game is ridiculously aggressive, and it becomes incredibly irritating incredibly quickly. But I digress. Even though each faction does have its own bonuses, the core gameplay is still going to be the same regardless of which one you choose. It's just that you'll find certain ones make it a bit easier to start out than others. For example, the Dutch are a pretty easy one to start out on, so if you find that you're having trouble with, say, the English or the French, then you might as well try out the Dutch and see how well you do there, because they get bonuses to trade, and trade is kind of your lifeblood in this thing. But of course, that may not necessarily matter to you if you can't figure out how to play the game in the first place. I mentioned this before when I talked about the presentation, specifically the UI. The game is just not accessible. The mouse controls have constant problems where you're trying to click on things and sometimes it registers double clicks instead of single clicks, and sometimes it just doesn't register a click at all. It ends up being kind of a mess. On top of that, moving units around the map is typically done with the numpad, because if you try to do it with the mouse, then that's also kind of finicky, and doing it with the arrow keys means you can only do left, right, up, or down. and moving diagonally is certainly something you have to do, which means that ultimately you're probably going to have to use the numpad. If your computer does not have a numpad, for example it's a laptop, or if you're not used to using the numpad, then that will be kind of an issue for you. Not to mention that various UI elements aren't exactly clear. You'll see a bunch of X's on things and you won't really be sure why they're there, and then you start messing around with the various colonist assignments and you're like, oh, that's why. But the game doesn't really tell you exactly what's going on there. The various report screens tend to throw a lot of numbers at you and don't explain what they actually mean, so you'll be left just sitting there scratching your head until you read the manual and figure out exactly what the game's trying to tell you. And that's about the second best advice I can give you with this thing, to read the manual, because once you do that, then you'll be like, oh, well, this is kind of making sense now, although it's still not very intuitive when you try to actually mess around with things. And the best advice I could give you is to see a strategy guide or a let's play. At the very least for grasping the gameplay basics, because it just kind of throws everything at you and just expects you to either figure it out on your own or just know right from the start. That's a very old school way of doing things, and that wouldn't really be a problem if it weren't for the UI being kind of a mess. But honestly, that's pretty much to be expected from an early 90s strategy game. They really hadn't figured everything out by then, and once they figured everything out later on in the 90s, then everything started to take better shape. Colonization was well before that started to happen, so you end up having this old school design with old school UI design as well, and it just ends up being something that takes a lot of getting used to if you're going to be even attempting to play this thing properly. And for a lot of people out there, that is going to be the major hurdle you have to get over in order to actually enjoy the game. But here's the thing, once you get past that, then you have to deal with the combat system being awful. Which ultimately leads me to my main conclusion. At its core, Colonization is not a bad game. In fact, it's a rather solid strategy game for 1994. But it just hasn't aged very well. Now keep in mind, I've been playing strategy video games for over 20 years at this point. I'm a veteran of these old school games. Problem is that I haven't played games this old in the strategy genre for quite a while. It took me quite a while to get back in the swing of things. And even then, I still feel like Colonization is just not my kind of strategy game. Even though I like the Civilization series, this really isn't Civ, it's its own thing, and while it's certainly competent at what it does, it's just not something I personally had a lot of fun playing. Your mileage may of course vary on that, especially if you're a big fan of micromanagement. I don't really like micromanagement very much, so that became the big problem when I was playing this. And of course, on top of that, it has the absolutely terrible combat system from the early Civ games, but that's beside the point. Ultimately, when I bring everything together here, I just have a hard time recommending Sid Meier's Colonization. Not because it's a bad game, because it certainly is not a bad game, but because it's an inaccessible game. If you're the kind of person who can put up with the terrible combat system as well as the sometimes frustrating UI elements, then you'll probably be able to get something out of Colonization. And of course, if you're a fan of old school strategy games, or you're a fan of the old Civ games, not the new ones, the old ones, then you may want to give Colonization a try if you haven't already. But it is an extremely difficult game to recommend for a casual strategy game fan or someone looking to get into the genre especially, or even someone who's just kind of new to retro games and hasn't really had a lot of strategy game experience under their belt. But if you're brave enough to give it a shot, then I say might as well go for it, especially if it goes on sale, because it's a very cheap game these days. I will of course have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up on GOG or Steam if you're interested, although personally I recommend the GOG version. But again, just be prepared for a game that is not going to hold your hand, and one that is very inaccessible to new players, and on top of that has some frustrating mechanics. Thanks for watching.